Hi guys, it's Hope, and I will be talking with you in detail and depth of the Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka court case. So, a bit of the background of this is in 1952, I believe, maybe 1951, the NAACP, the National Association for Advancement of Colored People, they encouraged parents to request and enroll their children into all-white schools. Now, the Board of Education in Topeka, they denied all parents' requests, including one of the parents, Oliver Brown, which is where the name Brown v. Board of Education comes from. So, once they were denied, the NAACP, they ended up filing a class action lawsuit against the Topeka Board of Education. So they ended up saying that there's not enough evidence to support that what they were saying about on their basis of children feeling inferior at these schools, at segregated schools, and there not being enough equal facilities and education for the students, and also the unconstitutionality of this. All of that, the Arkansas Supreme Court ruled that that's not true. There's not enough evidence to support what the NAACP was saying. So they ended up throwing this out of the window, basically saying that there's nothing they can do. And so what they did was the NAACP brings it to the U.S. Federal Supreme Court. Now, the U.S. Federal Supreme Court ended up grouping this in with several other cases of the time. Some of these cases were the Briggs versus Elliott of 1951, the Davis versus County School Board of Prince Edward County in 1952. There was also the Gebert versus Belton in 1952 also, and then the Bowling versus Sharp 1951 case. These were all very similar cases, so they ended up just tying them in together. But the attorney for Brown v. Board of Education was Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall was an African American. He was very good at his job. He actually ended up later becoming the first African American to serve on the Supreme Court. So he was very good at his job, and probably could have gone farther, or longer farther, if it weren't for his coloring of skin, which is awful. But he was able to help later win this case. So this was first argued in December 9th, 1952, and then it was once again argued in December 8th, 1953. So yeah, what they were trying to say was that the segregation of schools was a violation of the 14th Amendment, which the 14th Amendment grants to citizenship and equal civil and legal rights to all persons born or naturalized in the United States. They were also trying to argue that segregated schools brought a feeling of inferiority, which we did talk about in class, how students would feel inferior. I know that also in the MLK biography, he was talking about how psychologists of the time even stated that this was psychological and scientifically proven that these students really did have a long-lasting and probably lifelong issues because of this, because of the trauma and inferiority that segregation put onto them. So that's what the NAACP was trying to argue against for the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, On May 17th, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren gave the unanimous ruling that Brown, stating that the segregation was unconstitutional, and it did bring a feeling of inferiority to these students. Now, this was such a big ruling, not just because all of the prejudice of the time, but also because this overrules one of the much earlier cases, Plessy versus Ferguson, which was argued in 1896. Plessy versus Ferguson stated that as long as things were separate, or as long as things were equal, they could be separate, which is where segregation comes in. But this case, and Earl Warren, Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren, he denied that and overruled that, which is a big thing, stating that everything happening in the South, segregation, not just of schools, is unlawful. Now, after this case was argued, and won, it became a catalyst for other civil rights movements. And there were acts that were passed by the federal government that helped to further the cause of the civil rights movement. Now, one of these was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and nationality, which was a really big one, a really big win for them. And then they also had the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which bans any tests or taxes or anything that limits access to vote. And then the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which bans discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin, for who they're going to sell the houses to, what houses people can have, where the houses are, all of that, which was happening beforehand. Now, the first Brown v. Board of Education was not the only one. There was a second one under the same name, just it's a second one. This was argued in 1955. So the states after Brown v. Board of Education were not doing anything. There was no time set, or when segregation had to end in schools. There was no time set, so no one was doing anything because they didn't want to. So they were trying to work around the rules. Now the second one, they said that states must desegregate with all deliberate speed. Again, they failed to put in a date for when this had to happen. So states were able to work around this, and they didn't do anything. There was a big opposition to both of these in the South, and states and governors and all of the people in government, well, not all, but a lot of people in government were trying to work around this because they didn't want it. So, the aftermath of what happened from the Brown v. Board of Education, besides it being catalyst for the civil rights movement, so what happened in schools? Now, one of the most famous of the incidences after the court case went through, there were 9 students who enrolled in an all-white school in Little Rock, Arkansas. Now, they enrolled in the Central High School of Little Rock, and they went by the name of the Little Rock 9. They started attending the school in 1957, and they were there for a year. The first day, they were told that they should not go to school. They should wait till the second day to attend school. So that's what they did. So these students show up. Melba Matillo Ernest Green. Ernest Green was also the first African American to have ever graduated from Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And then there's Elizabeth Eckford, Minnie Jean Brown, Terrence Roberts, Carlotta Walls, Jefferson Thomas, Gloria Ray, and Thelma Mothershead. So, these students came on the second day of school. And when they did come, they were accompanied by ministers and family members to help protect them. As this was a high school, they needed a lot of protection. On the first day that they came, there was a large mob of white people outside the school. Not only were they being verbally abusive as they were shouting and threatening the students, but they were also throwing rocks at them. So, what happened was then on that first day that they came to school, the Arkansas governor, Orville Eugene Faubus, sent 270 soldiers from the Arkansas National Guard to block their entry into the school, which is defying federal law. Blatantly defying it. They weren't even working around it. It was blatant defying. Now, the students ended up leaving because they couldn't get into the school and everyone was being very violent against them. So they left. They returned 18 days later on September 23rd of 1957. How they got into the school was they were able to go through a side door. Now, once the protesters found out that they were inside the school, they became violent again. So they were starting to attack anyone of African descent outside of the school, who was also in the group of protesters. They weren't protesting, but they were out there as supporters. And then also, any reporters from the newspapers from the north that were down there covering this, they were also being attacked. So the students ended up going home again. 2 days later, they come back, but this time Eisenhower sends federal troops down to Arkansas, and they protect these students. So this is a big thing because now the President of the United States is getting involved, and Eisenhower is for these students. So he is protecting them, not barring them like the Arkansas governor was doing. Now, unfortunately, the students, when the Little Rock Nine were inside the school, the white students were not very nice to them. They would shout at them, yell at them, they would threaten them, and they were also physically abusive. One of the Little Rock Nine was done with it, and she ends up being expelled because she ends up fighting back, and she gets expelled. So now they're down to 8 of these African American students trying to just have an education in this no longer all-white school. So what happens after that school year ends is the Arkansas governor, he shuts down all schools in the Little Rock County. And a bunch of other southern cities did the same thing. What they did was they created a school choice program, which means that because private schools did not have to desegregate their schools because they're private schools, that the Arkansas government ends up having white students go to these private academies instead of public schools. So now anyone from African descent, they're not able to go to school anymore. But these white students are able to go to private academies now. So, and Little Rock Central High School, the one that the Little Rock Nine went to, it didn't open again until 1960. That's 3 years after they first stepped foot in the school. So this case is so important because it sets a foundation, saying that the government and the Supreme Court and the president, that they're no longer going to allow segregation because they were making others feel inferior, which they didn't care about before, but now they do, and it was able to be a catalyst for future events. Unfortunately, there was still a lot of violence, and there were other situations, such as in the Little Rock Central High School, there were other places that were just as violent when trying to desegregate, and they had other issues, such as they would completely shut down public parks, for example, that were in Ike's biography, he was talking about they were shutting down public parks because all of the white people didn't want to have to desegregate those parks, and so they just shut down the parks before they could be desegregated. So they ended up doing different things like that all throughout the South, and this is just one example from this high school of how this court case was able to change the civil rights movement for the better. So, anyways, I hope that you learned a lot from this, and I hope you guys have a great day, morning, evening, whatever time it is you're watching this. So, have a good one.